Flight attendant demands he move to the back. He smiles, then shows a badge that makes her back away. The cabin lights glinted off the flight attendant's polished name tag as she stood with hands on her hips, glaring down the aisle at a solitary passenger. Her voice carried a subtle edge, commanding him to move to the back. Everyone around froze, tension thick in the recycled air. The passenger seemed oddly composed, perhaps even amused. Then, in a moment that would haunt the flight crew for weeks, he slipped a hand into his jacket pocket and revealed a badge the flight attendant instantly recognized. Fear flickered across her face, and the power dynamic reversed in a single dramatic heartbeat. The day dawned bright at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, one of the busiest airports in the world. Thousands of travelers milled about, dragging suitcases and anxiously glancing at departure screens. Families, business travelers, and wide-eyed tourists formed snaking lines at the security checkpoints manned by the Transportation Security Administration, TSA. Everyone had somewhere to be, and it felt like the entire world was in a hurry. In the midst of this organized chaos stood Jacob Tyler, looking utterly ordinary in dark jeans and a crisp navy blue polo. He held a small black carry-on bag and a folded newspaper under his arm. He scanned the concourse with calm brown eyes, noticing everything and everyone around him. His hair was neatly trimmed, and if someone took the time to study him, they might notice the slight bulge of something tucked discreetly in his jacket. But few paid attention. He had cultivated a talent for blending in, appearing so mild-mannered that no one found him worth a second glance. Jacob's flight was Delta Airlines Flight 742 en route from Atlanta to Los Angeles. He had arrived at the airport well ahead of schedule, as was his habit, clearing security and waiting patiently at gate B36. It was a busy morning, with flight attendants rushing to their assigned aircraft and passengers lining up early to jostle for overhead bin space. The faint aroma of coffee drifted from a nearby cafe. A tall, slim flight attendant walked by Marissa Kelly, her name tag read. She had the assured posture of someone who knew how to take charge. Her hair was slicked back in a neat chignon, and her uniform was impeccably pressed. She offered a polite but distant smile to a mother struggling with two young children, then shot a pointed glance at a teenager wearing noise-cancelling headphones with music, so loud you could hear it from 5 feet away. Marissa had high standards. She believed in meticulous organization and a disciplined approach to airline service. Meanwhile, Jacob quietly studied the people around him. A seasoned traveler might have pegged him for law enforcement or military, but he gave off just enough casual energy to remain inconspicuous to the untrained eye. He recognized Small tells a shifting man with a suspicious package, a nervous teen traveling alone, a boisterous corporate group laughing loudly. He tucked all these observations away. The job had taught him to remain vigilant, always reading a room or an airport for potential threats. That was part of his life now, even if he rarely announced it. As the gate agent began boarding, Jacob boarded early due to his seat assignment. He moved through the jetway slowly, letting other passengers pass him. If anyone happened to look carefully, they might notice how his gaze lingered on every corner of the corridor, or how his footfalls made almost no sound on the worn carpet. The hush of the moment seemed to envelop him. Stepping onto the plane, the pressurized air greeted him alongside another flight attendant, Tanya Ruiz, who checked his boarding pass. Tanya offered a genuine smile. "Good morning, sir," she said kindly. "Seat 12C to your left. Enjoy the flight." Jacob thanked her with a polite nod, moving down the aisle. The Boeing 757 was fresh from a routine cleaning, though the faint smell of stale coffee and recirculated air still lingered. Families struggled with overhead bins, a couple argued in hushed voices near the exit row, and a man in a sharp business suit was already on the phone, negotiating some deal right there in the aisle. Jacob found seat 12C and slipped in quietly. He was an aisle person. Being able to move or respond quickly was key. As he settled, he watched the parade of passengers file in. Then came Marissa, the same flight attendant he'd seen at the gate. She wore a businesslike expression as she checked seat assignments, directed people to overhead compartments, and tried to maintain a semblance of calm in the mid-cabin madness. She did her job with efficiency, though one could sense an undercurrent of tension beneath her professional demeanor. Somewhere, a baby started crying. A teenage girl in seat 11 rolled her eyes dramatically, and the mother in seat 10D tried to comfort the wailing infant in her arms. Marissa stepped forward to assist, but her expression suggested she was close to losing her patience. The flight was nearly full, and the controlled chaos of boarding was in full swing. Only about half of the overhead bins remained open. Jacob casually glanced at the next row, noticing an older gentleman fumbling with a small suitcase. That gentleman, Mr. Arnold Baker, shot an apologetic look at Jacob as he accidentally bumped seat 12C with the suitcase. Jacob gave him a small, reassuring nod, a gesture that everything was fine. A moment later, Mr. Baker managed to stow the luggage and carefully settled into seat 11C. The overhead bin slammed shut above him, sounding a note of finality. 10 minutes later, the plane door was closed. The safety demo began, delivered by Tanya on the intercom and illustrated by Marissa in the aisle. Jacob listened courteously. He never tuned out these instructions, no matter how often he flew. After all, preparedness was a professional habit. At last, the aircraft pushed back from the gate. The engines roared to life, vibrating through the cabin. As the plane taxied, Marissa did one last seatbelt check, her sharp eyes surveying each passenger. The plane turned onto the runway, paused as if drawing in a breath, and then surged forward with an accelerating force that pressed everyone into their seats. They lifted off, the ground falling away beneath them. The flight to Los Angeles had officially begun. Jacob closed his eyes momentarily, feeling a tingle of anticipation. He had a hunch this flight might be anything but ordinary. And he was right. High above the clouds, the cabin lights glowed softly. People began to get comfortable, laptops opened, headphones emerged, and the faint clatter of drink carts signaled that beverage service would soon begin. The flight was projected to take around 4 hours, depending on wind patterns. With the initial rush of takeoff behind them, everyone settled into a routine. Conversation rose and fell in gentle waves. Jacob casually flipped through the in-flight magazine, occasionally glancing at passengers. He had a practiced ease. He noticed how certain individuals tapped their feet anxiously, how another passenger seemed to be quietly rehearsing a speech, and how the couple in row 14 whispered in hushed tones. To anyone else, it might seem like idle people watching, but to Jacob, it was part of a critical skill set. He made no overt moves. He simply observed. Marissa, meanwhile, had shed her safety demo facade and resumed her position as the primary flight attendant in the front cabin. As she pushed the drink cart slowly down the aisle, Tanya handled the rear section. Marissa's posture was impeccable, her shoulders straight, chin slightly lifted, yet her eyes had a faint, pinched look, like she was annoyed or worried about something. When she reached Jacob's row, she took one glance at him, then did a double take. Something in his face or his body language must have caught her attention. It was the sort of subtle recognition that flight attendants sometimes have. They can sense a passenger who might require special attention, for good or bad reasons. Jacob smiled politely, but Marissa's answering expression was cool. "Something to drink?" she asked curtly. "Just water, please," he replied. She poured water into a plastic cup, handed it to him, and moved on without another word. Jacob shrugged inwardly. He'd encountered flight attendants with a range of personalities, some warm and engaging, others strictly business. Marissa clearly fell into the second category. Still, it was no big deal. The man across the aisle, in seat 12D, asked for a diet soda and got the same chilly treatment. A few seats up, the mother with the baby needed assistance with warming a bottle, and Marissa pursed her lips but obliged. Something about her manner made the mother stiffen, as though she felt judged. A tiny ripple of tension began forming in the cabin, emanating from the front. Marissa wasn't going out of her way to be rude, but an undercurrent of dissatisfaction was evident in her clipped tone and quick, impatient movements. Jacob took a sip of water. The plane hummed as it cut through the sky. He caught a fleeting glimpse of light flashing on the wing through the window. They must have been at cruising altitude by now. Suddenly, a passenger from the back of the plane, a tall, boisterous man wearing a sports jersey, came trudging up the aisle. He was looking for the lavatory, apparently confused about its location. Marissa intercepted him near row 10, placing a firm hand on his chest to stop him from going further. Her voice took on a reprimanding tone. "Sir, you can't just wander up to the front lavatory. Please use the one assigned to your section in the rear." The man blinked, then opened his mouth to protest, but Marissa was unyielding. Her volume rose just enough for neighboring rows to overhear. "I said, the forward lavatory is reserved for first class or special circumstances. You'll have to use the one behind you." He hesitated, possibly embarrassed by the public scolding, but eventually turned around and trudged back down the aisle. Marissa let out a small, exasperated sigh. She glanced around to see if anyone else was going to challenge the rules. Her gaze lingered on Jacob, who quickly averted his eyes back to the magazine. Even though she didn't say a word, Jacob sensed her simmering impatience. He could almost hear her inner monologue. Why can't these passengers just follow the rules? Half an hour passed. A bit of turbulence shuddered through the cabin, prompting the captain's voice over the intercom advising everyone to keep their seat belts fastened. The seatbelt sign illuminated overhead. Most people complied, though one or two made quick dashes to the restroom. Jacob carefully stowed the tray table and tried to relax. But the feeling of tension was palpable. Something about Marissa's attitude, combined with the usual stresses of air travel, was creating a potent brew. As if on cue, Marissa reappeared at row 12, scanning the seats. She seemed to frown when she noticed Jacob's carry-on bag, partially tucked under the seat in front of him, but slightly protruding. In a clipped tone, she said, "Sir, your bag is supposed to be fully under the seat during turbulence. Please move it." Jacob complied immediately. "Certainly," he said, pushing the bag further in. He did nothing to antagonize her, yet her expression suggested she was still displeased. She nodded curtly and continued down the aisle, quietly checking for any other infractions she could correct. Jacob's mind flickered over the last time he had encountered a flight attendant with such rigid control issues. It often ended poorly, either with a confrontation or a meltdown. But he kept calm, reminding himself that he wasn't here to play referee. He had another responsibility on this flight, and he intended to fulfill it while staying under the radar. And so he sat quietly, sipping his water. He watched the interplay of personalities and stifled sighs, the rolled eyes from the teen in row 11, the worried glances from the older gentleman in 11C, and the fussy baby in 10D. The flight rumbled on, inching closer to Los Angeles with each passing minute. But tension has a way of building when no one addresses it, and it wouldn't be long before a spark set it aflame. 2 hours into the flight, the seatbelt sign was off. Passengers dozed, chatted, or watched the in-flight entertainment. Jacob noticed that the sports jersey man from the back was once again walking toward the middle of the plane, presumably to stretch his legs. This time, he caught Marissa's eye well before he reached the forward lavatory. Sensing her disapproval, he turned around and sat in an empty seat near row 20 for a moment. Effectively avoiding another scolding, Jacob decided to stand and stretch as well, moving toward the aisle. He took a step toward the rear, giving Marissa a wide berth. He wasn't looking for conflict, and he sensed that she was on a short fuse. But fate had other ideas. When Jacob slipped into the aisle, he nearly collided with a passenger from the row behind him. Their shoulders brushed. The passenger apologized hurriedly, and Jacob murmured a quick "no worries." But it was enough to catch Marissa's attention. She turned from the row she was monitoring, saw Jacob standing, and narrowed her eyes. She approached him with that no-nonsense stride. "Sir," she said, "may I ask what you're doing out of your seat? We've had intermittent turbulence, and the captain recommends everyone remain seated as much as possible." Jacob glanced at the overhead seatbelt sign. It was off. He answered politely, "I just needed to stretch my legs for a moment. I'll be brief." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "We prefer passengers remain seated unless it's absolutely necessary," she said. Her voice carried a distinct edge. Others nearby glanced over, sensing a confrontation. "If you need the restroom, use the one in the back, but don't linger in the aisle." Jacob nodded, deciding to let it go. "Yes, ma'am." He started to move toward the rear, but just then, an older woman up front pressed her call button. Marissa's head snapped around. She muttered something under her breath, then pivoted sharply, brushing past Jacob. He almost stumbled from the force of her shoulder, connecting with his. The tension soared. Jacob watched her storm up the aisle, mentally noting the brewing conflict. This flight attendant was not just strict. She seemed to be on a power trip or under extreme stress that was manifesting as irritability. Jacob quietly retreated to his seat, deciding he would wait until the fuss died down before trying to stretch again. The flight was over halfway to Los Angeles. He could endure the cramped space for another hour or two if needed. He exhaled, trying to refocus on the reason he was truly on this flight. Moments later, Marissa returned, her expression as taut as ever. She looked like she was scanning the cabin for further rule breakers to correct. Her gaze landed on row 12, specifically on Jacob. She frowned as though he were out of place, or perhaps she'd decided his presence was somehow suspect. Then came the fateful announcement from the flight deck. A patch of heavier turbulence ahead. The seatbelt sign dinged on, and the captain's voice echoed through the cabin, instructing passengers to remain seated. Marissa began her usual compliance check. The plane shuddered as it hit a mild air pocket, making her grip a nearby seat for balance. Jacob complied immediately, snapping his belt on. He was used to following instructions and had no intention of starting a confrontation. But fate had more in store. A woman in seat 9F stood up, looking panicked. She clutched her stomach. She was turning pale, evidently ill. She pleaded with Marissa to let her quickly use the restroom. Marissa said something about how the turbulence was too severe, but the woman was borderline frantic. Her face was covered in sweat. She was about to throw up, and the nearest lavatory was at the front. Time was clearly of the essence. Jacob could see the desperation in the woman's face. He caught Marissa's eye and offered a silent, sympathetic look, but Marissa stiffened. Instead of guiding the sick woman to the restroom, she began scolding her for ignoring the seat belt sign. Others around them gasped, and a few tried to intervene, insisting that she let the poor woman go to the lavatory before she got sick in the aisle. Eventually, with extreme reluctance, Marissa stepped aside, rolling her eyes and muttering under her breath. The woman rushed to the front lavatory, retching noises audible to anyone nearby. Jacob felt his sympathy flare. The last thing the lady needed was a humiliating scolding in front of a full flight. Marissa turned sharply to see if anyone was judging her, her eyes locked on Jacob's. She must have read condemnation in his expression because her features hardened. This was no longer about following procedure. It was personal. She marched down the aisle until she stood directly in front of him. "Is there something you need, sir?" she asked, voice dripping with ice. Jacob calmly shook his head. "No, ma'am," she huffed. ignoring the whimpering baby in row 10, ignoring the man who was raising his hand in row 15. Her entire focus had narrowed to Jacob. "You keep staring at me. If you have an issue, you need to address it with me directly." Jacob frowned, eyebrows knitting together. "I apologize if it seemed I was staring. I just felt concern for the passenger who was ill." Marissa folded her arms. "I don't need you to question how I do my job." Jacob kept his voice level. "I didn't question your job performance. I only think she needed immediate assistance." "I'm sure you understand." Her nostrils flared. A hush fell over the rows nearby. Everyone was listening, the hum of the plane providing an ominous background. It was a delicate moment, one that could have dissipated if Marissa had walked away. But she didn't. "You know what?" she spat, eyes blazing. "There's an empty seat in the back row next to the lavatories. If you're going to stand here silently judging me for following procedure, maybe you'd be more comfortable there." Jacob blinked, caught off guard. He opened his mouth to protest, but she was on a tirade. "Go on, gather your belongings. I'm not asking you're moving to the back." The command was so abrupt and so public that it drew sharp intakes of breath from the other passengers. "Mr." Baker in row 11 gaped. The teen in row 11A peered over the seat, and the baby in row 10. D cried louder, as if picking up on the tension. Jacob glanced around, aware that all eyes were on him. He tried to keep his voice gentle but firm. "Ma'am, I paid for this seat." Marissa cut him off. "I don't care. You're making me uncomfortable, and that's enough reason. I'm the authority figure on this plane, do you understand? If you don't comply, I'll have the captain speak to you." The entire scene felt surreal to Jacob. He had no intention of escalating the issue, but her demand was unreasonable. Before he could formulate a diplomatic response, Marissa snapped, "Get your bag! Move! Now!" Jacob paused. Remembering his training, de-escalate, remain calm, do not let the situation spiral. He exhaled slowly. "All right," he said evenly, "I'll move." A triumphant look flickered across Marissa's face. Other passengers watched, some disapproving, some fearful that the altercation might become worse. Jacob stood, retrieved his carry-on from under the seat, and stepped into the aisle. He could sense the tension in the air, the disbelief among the onlookers. The flight attendant, it seemed, had lost any sense of compassion or reason. Jacob turned to her and, with an almost polite gesture, reached for the slim black badge wallet in his pocket. He opened it just enough for her to see the metallic flash within. That was all it took. Her eyes widened. She stepped back as if she'd touched a live wire. Her posture changed in an instant from overbearing authority to startled, pale-faced confusion. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. At that moment, the power dynamic shifted so dramatically that the onlookers felt a jolt through the cabin. A hush fell over the rows. Jacob looked her in the eye, a subtle smile tugging at his lips, and said quietly, "I believe we need to have a different conversation now." The tense silence in the cabin was so complete that the whir of the airplane's engines seemed loud in comparison. Marissa stood motionless, staring at the badge in Jacob's hand. He snapped the badge wallet shut and slipped it back into his pocket. She swallowed hard, her face suddenly pale. The passengers nearby exchanged confused glances, not sure what they had just witnessed. Mr. Baker in seat 11C craned his neck, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever Jacob had shown her. The teen in 11 pressed her face against the window, wide-eyed, as if expecting a dramatic showdown. Marissa's voice came out as a shaky whisper. You're law enforcement." Jacob kept his voice neutral but calm, the faintest undertone of authority creeping in. "Let's just say I'm someone entrusted with a significant responsibility, and I have no intention of allowing things to get out of hand on this flight." He turned to the curious onlookers, offering a reassuring nod that everything was fine, though it was far from fine in reality. Jacob had been traveling as an undercover air marshal, mandated by the Transportation Security Administration, but it was a detail he only revealed if necessary. His presence was to maintain the safety of the flight, ensuring no hijacking or terrorism attempts, not to quell flight attendant squabbles. Yet Marissa's behavior had forced his hand. Tanya, the other flight attendant, arrived mid-aisle, having sensed the commotion. She caught sight of Marissa's stricken expression and Jacob's calm demeanor, brows furrowing in concern. "Is everything all right here?" she asked quietly. Marissa seemed unable to speak, so Jacob answered. "We need to have a private conversation, perhaps near the galley." He kept his tone measured, not wanting to inflame the situation further in front of the passengers. Tanya looked between the two, clearly sensing the tension. She cleared her throat. "All right. Let's step to the front galley, please." She gestured politely for Jacob and Marissa to follow. A ripple of uncertainty ran through the cabin as the flight attendants and the mysterious passenger with a badge disappeared behind the curtain, leaving behind a swirl of questions. In the narrow galley, the three stood awkwardly. The plane's engines droned, and the scent of brewed coffee lingered in the space. It was cramped, so they stood close, forced to confront each other's expressions. Tanya spoke first, voice low. "Marissa, what's going on? Who is this passenger?" Jacob looked at Marissa, waiting to see if she would volunteer the information. She hesitated, her usual confidence evaporating. "He's an air marshal," she finally managed. Tanya's eyes widened. "Oh," she breathed. I didn't realize we had an air marshal on this flight. Did the flight deck get notified?" "They were supposed to," Jacob said. "Usually the captain is informed. I suspect this was simply not communicated to the rest of the cabin crew. That happens sometimes." He paused, giving Marissa a chance to regain her composure. "Marissa here asked me to move to the back of the plane. I was willing to comply, but her approach was concerning." Marissa clenched her jaw. "I didn't know." He was staring, and it made me uncomfortable. Then he seemed to be critiquing my job performance. I was just trying to maintain order." Tanya placed a hand on Marissa's arm, partly to soothe her, partly to keep her steady. "We have protocols, Marissa. Even if you're uncomfortable, the way we address it is important. Especially if it involves a passenger who paid for his seat." Marissa's voice turned defensive. "He was looking at me like I was doing something wrong. And then he showed me his badge, and I didn't know he was allowed to do that." Jacob spoke up gently. "I only showed my credentials because you insisted I move and threatened to have the captain intervene. I'm not here to cause trouble or question your authority. But you singled me out." Marissa's eyes flashed. "Because you were making me uneasy." She caught herself glancing at Tanya, who frowned at her tone. "Softer," Marissa continued. "I realize now I misread the situation." Tanya nodded solemnly. "We're all under stress, but we have to handle these things professionally. Let me speak to the captain about how to proceed." "Jacob, officer, would you like to stay in your seat, or—" "I'd prefer to remain in my original seat," Jacob replied. "I haven't violated any rules. I'd like to keep a low profile and do my job quietly. But if necessary, I can move. It's your call. I'm more concerned about the way this situation escalated in front of the passengers." Marissa's expression flickered with shame. "I realize I overstepped. It's been a stressful week. I'm sorry." Jacob studied her closely, sensing genuine remorse. He let out a long, slow exhale. "Accepted. Let's just smooth things over for the remainder of the flight. I'm not looking to file a complaint." Marissa's shoulders sagged in relief. "Thank you." Tanya stepped in, gently steering the conversation. "Why don't I handle this section of the plane for the rest of the flight? Marissa, you can focus on first class and keep an eye on that front lavatory. We're about an hour and a half from landing. Let's just get through without any more incidents." Marissa nodded, grateful for a solution that would keep her away from the direct source of her embarrassment. She kept her gaze on the floor, avoiding Jacob's eyes. "All right." Jacob offered a final nod, turning to head back to his seat. The tension in the galley began to dissipate, replaced by a lingering awkwardness. He felt a surge of relief. The confrontation was resolved without him having to assert his air marshal authority any further. Maintaining peace was his prime directive. As he made his way back to row, 12 heads turned, and anxious glances followed. He offered a mild smile to Mr. Baker, who looked a bit relieved. The teen in 11A stared at him openly. Jacob sank into his seat, hoping that would be the end of the ordeal, but he had no idea that the real drama was only just beginning. The plane droned on toward Los Angeles. After the confrontation in the front galley, Marissa retreated to first class, leaving Tanya to oversee the main cabin. Jacob tried to resume his calm vigilance, but a lingering tension remained among the passengers. Rumors and whispered conversations flitted about. People were curious who Jacob really was and why the flight attendant had backed down so quickly. Jacob gazed out the window to his left, the sky a vast expanse of deep blue layered with shifting clouds. The seatbelt sign was off once again. A few passengers took advantage of the lull to use the restroom or grab items from the overhead bin. Others remained seated, exchanging quiet gossip. A sudden jolt of turbulence rattled the plane, and the captain's voice chimed over the intercom, advising passengers to stay seated. Jacob fastened his belt again, scanning the aisles. Tanya moved carefully, guiding the drink cart to the galley before taking her jump seat. The older gentleman, Mr. Baker, glanced back at Jacob and offered a slight shrug, as if to say, "This flight, huh?" Jacob responded with a cordial tilt of his head. A muffled argument near row 18 drew Jacob's attention. A couple was hissing angry words at each other, barely contained. The man gestured wildly, though he kept his voice low enough not to cause a full scene. The woman dabbed her eyes, a tear threatening to escape. Jacob turned his head just enough to watch surreptitiously, instincts pricking. While domestic quarrels weren't his jurisdiction in the air, tension could escalate, and he needed to be aware of potential chaos. The plane jolted again. This time, the turbulence was harsher, causing the overhead bins to rattle loudly. A small cry from the baby in row 10. The toddler in row 9 squealed in fear. Tanya's voice rang out, urging everyone to remain seated. She made sure her harness was secure. Jacob's grip tightened on the armrest. He was used to rough skies, but that didn't make it any more pleasant. Suddenly, a shriek from the back. Heads whipped around. It was the sports jersey man again, stumbling against a seat. His hands flailed, trying to catch himself. A passenger in row 20 let out a startled yelp as he landed in her lap. The plane lurched once more, then leveled off, the turbulence subsiding almost as quickly as it arrived. Tanya rushed back to help, calming everyone. The man apologized profusely, looking rattled. "I'm sorry," he gasped, face pale. "Lost my balance." Jacob let out a slow breath. The immediate danger had passed. He loosened his grip on the armrest, scanning the cabin for anything else amiss. The couple in row 18 had settled into a sullen silence. The mother in row 10 tried to rock her fussy baby to sleep. Tension coiled in the air, but no direct threat was evident. He leaned his head back, letting his eyes drift shut for a moment. De-escalation was part of his job. He tried to center himself, inhaling and exhaling deeply, focusing on his internal calm. As he did so, an unexpected tingle of intuition made him open his eyes again. Something felt off. Across the aisle, in seat 12D, the man in the business suit had returned from somewhere, likely the lavatory. He was fiddling with a small black device, half hidden by his laptop bag. Jacob's instincts flared. The item didn't look like a standard phone or music player. It had an antenna. The man's head was bowed, a baseball cap pulled low over his face, which was unusual to wear inside the cabin. In a single glance, Jacob registered that the man's posture was tense, his eyes darting around as he manipulated the device. Jacob's heart rate kicked up a notch. He'd seen all sorts of gadgets, some innocuous, some not. He decided to watch carefully, not wanting to cause a scene. He shifted slightly in his seat, angling to get a better look. The man seemed unaware that Jacob was observing him. Another minute passed, and the man tucked the device into his laptop bag with swift movements. Jacob waited, all senses on alert. If this man was operating some prohibited technology, or, worse, a device that could threaten the plane's safety, Jacob needed to intervene, but he also needed more information. Acting prematurely could cause widespread panic or tip off a potential threat. If there was one lesson hammered into every air marshal's training, it was to gather intel before making a move. The plane once again rattled with mild turbulence, jostling drinks and overhead luggage. The man in 12D clutched his laptop bag, as though protecting its contents. His gaze flicked to Jacob, noticing for the first time that Jacob was watching him. Their eyes locked briefly. A flicker of suspicion crossed the man's face. He cleared his throat and turned away, feigning disinterest. Jacob saw the man's knuckles whiten around the handle of the bag. A bead of sweat glistened on his temple. Something was definitely wrong. Jacob carefully rose from his seat the moment the turbulence eased enough to allow movement. He didn't want to alarm the entire row, so he made a show of heading toward the back. As he passed the business suit man, he caught a glimpse of some kind of homemade label on the inside of the laptop bag, a cluster of odd, scribbled symbols that set off alarm bells. But he forced himself not to linger. He made his way to the rear galley, where Tanya was replenishing supplies. She glanced up, concern etching her features. "Everything all right?" she asked quietly, mindful of the other passengers in earshot. Jacob spoke in a hushed tone. "I need to speak with you privately." Tanya set aside the carton of juice. She followed Jacob into the small crew area where they could speak without attracting attention. The hum of the aircraft engines enveloped them. Jacob leaned in. "There's a passenger in seat 12D. I spotted him tinkering with some device that didn't look like standard electronics. He's acting suspicious." Tanya's eyes widened. "What kind of device?" "I'm not entirely sure. Could be a personal hotspot, but the design looked off. It had an antenna, and he appeared very guarded about it." She swallowed, her voice tense. "What do you want me to do?" Jacob weighed his options. "I need to assess the threat level. If he's just using an unauthorized electronic device, it might be an FAA violation, but not necessarily a threat to flight safety. However, if it's something more nefarious, we need to coordinate with the captain. For now, let's not alarm the passengers. I'll keep an eye on him. If you or another crew member can discreetly observe him from a different angle, that could help." Tanya nodded rapidly, heart clearly racing. "All right. Should I inform Marissa or the captain?" Jacob paused. "Given my earlier confrontation with Marissa, I'm not sure if that's the best approach. I'd prefer speaking directly to the captain, but protocol says the pilot in command must be notified about a potential threat. Discretion is key if we approach him aggressively, and he is dangerous. It could escalate. I'll let you know when we should alert the captain." Tanya agreed, chewing her lip anxiously. "Understood. I'll pass a quick note to the captain if you think it's urgent." Jacob weighed the situation. "Let's wait a bit more. Let me see if he does anything else suspicious. Keep an eye on the seatbelt sign, because if it goes on again, I don't want him panicking if he can't move around. I'll be back in a few minutes." Tanya nodded, stepping aside so Jacob could return to the main cabin. He made his way up the aisle, noticing how passengers eyed him curiously. Some recognized him from the earlier spat with Marissa. Others were simply intrigued by anyone moving with such quiet purpose. He forced his expression to remain neutral, returning to seat 12C. The man in 12D was sitting stiffly, staring straight ahead. His laptop tray was down now, a spreadsheet glowing on the screen, but he seemed unfocused. Jacob settled in, glancing sideways, heart beating at a measured pace thanks to training, but tension coiling in his muscles. If this passenger was truly a threat, some kind of extremist or saboteur, Jacob had to act swiftly yet strategically. Minutes ticked by. The man in 12D typed on his laptop, glancing at the device bag occasionally. Once he shifted to reach inside it, but then seemed to think better of it. Outside, the sky began to darken as the plane moved west, chasing the sun. Another hour to Los Angeles. Then it happened. The man carefully slid the laptop bag onto his lap, unzipped it, and pulled out the black device again. He hunched over, partially hiding it behind the laptop screen. Jacob could see the faint glow of an LED. The man pressed a button, glancing around. Their eyes met. Time seemed to slow. Jacob inhaled, preparing to stand up before he could fully rise. The plane gave another violent shudder of turbulence, sending the device skittering off the man's lap. It clattered onto the aisle floor, within view of several passengers. A gasp rippled through the cabin. In that split second, Jacob saw the device clearly: wires, a small blinking light, and an antenna. This was no random gadget. Adrenaline surged through him. If it was a bomb or a communications disruptor, they had a serious situation on their hands. The man lunged, trying to snatch it off the floor. Jacob lunged too, his reflexes honed. He grabbed the man's wrist, preventing him from resecuring the device. Passengers shrieked. A kid in row 13 cried out in alarm. Tanya rushed forward. All eyes were on the confrontation unfolding in row 12. Jacob fixed the man with a hard stare, voice cutting through the chaos. "Sir, one need you to remain calm. Put your hands where I can see them." The man's eyes darted wildly. He seemed ready to fight or flee. Jacob tightened his grip, forcibly guiding the man's hands up in a surrender position. Another passenger kicked the device away, sending it sliding a few rows ahead. Chaos reigned. Some passengers screamed. The baby shrieked. The plane jolted again. In the midst of it all, Marissa reappeared at the curtain separating first class, eyes wide. She saw Jacob grappling with a passenger and looked momentarily stunned. Jacob shouted over the uproar, "Everyone remains seated. Flight attendant, get the captain on the intercom. Now!" Tanya's face was pale, but she nodded, darting toward the phone to contact the cockpit. Marissa stood frozen, uncertain whether to help Jacob or manage the frightened passengers. The man in 12D struggled, but Jacob pinned his arms, waiting for backup. This was no longer about petty seat assignments or personal grudges. This was a potential threat to all souls aboard. And though Marissa had tried to flex her authority earlier, it was Jacob, calm, trained, resolute, who now stood between a suspicious device and the lives of everyone on flight 742. The tension in the airplane cabin exploded like a pressure valve, releasing steam. Passengers craned their necks or ducked down in fear, unsure if they were in danger. Tanya's voice crackled over the intercom. "Shaky but authoritative, Captain. We have a security situation in the main cabin. Urgent assistance requested." Jacob secured the suspect's wrists, twisting them behind his back. A wave of panic threatened to break across the rows, people surging to see what was happening or to flee. He needed them calm. "Everyone, please remain seated and keep your seatbelts fastened," he called out, voice firm. "We have the situation under control." The man in the business suit, sweating, eyes darting, strained against Jacob's hold. "You don't understand," he gasped. "It's not what it looks like." Jacob maintained his grip, then explained, but the man only shook his head, chest heaving. Tanya, finishing her brief update to the cockpit, rushed back. Marissa hovered uncertainly, trying to corral frantic passengers who were half standing. Tanya helped Jacob by grabbing a pair of plastic restraints from an emergency kit near the galley. They quickly bound the man's wrists. Marissa, regaining some composure, addressed the passengers in a clipped but commanding voice. "Please stay calm. We have an aviation security officer on board who's handling the situation. There is no immediate threat." She gestured for everyone to sit. Most passengers listened, albeit with trembling hands and wide eyes. Some whispered prayers. Others shot frantic text messages while the plane still had enough coverage. A child whimpered, clutching a stuffed toy. The tension was suffocating. Jacob picked up the suspicious device from the floor where it had slid. The plane hit another pocket of turbulence, nearly toppling him, but he steadied himself. He examined the device, noticing the small LED indicator flickering. "Where's the off switch?" he demanded, glancing at the bound man. "No!" the man cried. "You can't just switch it off. It's a custom transmitter. If you do it wrong, it might—" He broke off, eyes wild with fear. Jacob's pulse pounded. "It might what?" he demanded. The man hesitated, then muttered, "It might overload, short-circuit, or—" Jacob didn't need to hear the rest. He carefully set the device on the seat, the blinking lead casting an eerie glow. The plane jolted once more. The pilot's voice came on the intercom, tense and clipped. "This is the captain speaking. We understand there's a security matter. We're contacting air traffic control. Everyone, please follow flight crew instructions and remain calm." Marissa rushed to the phone again, presumably receiving instructions from the cockpit. She hung up, her face grim. "Captain wants to divert," she announced, looking at Jacob. Jacob nodded. "Makes sense. We can't risk continuing to LAX with this device on board." He looked down at the suspect. "What is your name?" The man glowered. "Dean. Dean Miller. What does this device do, Dean?" Dean clamped his mouth shut, refusing to answer. Jacob studied him. "If you won't cooperate, we'll treat it as a bomb threat. Is that what you want?" Dean swallowed hard. It's not a bomb. Then what is it?" For a moment, Dean looked like he might cry. His shoulders trembled. "It's a signal jammer," he admitted. I developed it to block certain communication frequencies for private use. No harm intended." Marissa scowled. "Why would you bring that on a plane? That's dangerous. Illegal." Dean squirmed. Someone threatened me, said if I didn't block certain phone communications during this flight, they'd release compromising info. It's complicated." Jacob's gaze hardened. "So you're interfering with the plane's communication systems?" Dean shook his head vehemently. No, I swear it's only targeted for cellular signals, not the plane's navigation. I didn't want to do it, but they threatened my family. I'm so sorry. I tried to hide it." A wave of relief and anger warred within Jacob. A signal jammer was still illegal, but less catastrophic than a bomb. "Threatening your family?" Jacob repeated. "Who's they?" Dean refused to meet his eyes. "I can't, if they find out I talked," Jacob exhaled. "Well, now you have bigger problems. The pilot is diverting, we'll be making an emergency landing, and you'll be in federal custody. Your best bet is to cooperate." Dean sagged, tears glinting in his eyes. He nodded weakly, though he didn't offer more details. Jacob turned to Tanya and Marissa. "We need to stow this device somewhere secure, away from passengers, and keep him restrained for the rest of the flight." Marissa stepped up with surprising resolve, pointing toward a metal storage compartment in the galley. "We can lock it in there double-latched." Jacob nodded, carefully picking up the jammer. The lead still blinked ominously, but if it was truly just a frequency disruptor, it posed no immediate threat of explosion, at least in theory. He moved swiftly to the galley, with Marissa clearing the way. They placed the device inside, locking it tight. Tanya remained by Dean's side, guiding him to the bulkhead seat at the front of the coach section. He stumbled, eyes wide in shame and fear, but he didn't resist. She secured his seatbelt with the plastic restraints still around his wrists. Nearby passengers cowered or looked away, hearts hammering. Jacob grabbed his phone to see if he could get a signal to report the situation to the Federal Air Marshal Operations Center, but the flight was too far from major towers, or perhaps the jammer had already done enough damage. No signal. He had to rely on the flight deck's communications with air traffic control. Marissa, returning from locking the device, approached Jacob tentatively. Her earlier antagonism had vanished, replaced by a shaken, apologetic demeanor. She opened her mouth to speak but hesitated. Jacob turned, meeting her gaze. "Yes?" she swallowed. I wanted to say sorry. I completely lost my cool earlier, and now you just potentially saved us from something far worse. Thank you." Jacob's expression softened. Apology accepted. "Let's just focus on getting everyone safely on the ground." A flicker of relief passed across her face. She nodded. "We're diverting to Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport. The captain says we're about 30 minutes out. We'll have emergency services on standby." Jacob blew out a breath. The day had escalated far beyond petty seat disputes. "Right. Let's keep everyone calm. You and Tanya do your best to reassure passengers. I'll keep an eye on the suspect. Once we land, law enforcement will take over." Marissa nodded, resolve shining in her eyes. Together, they turned to face the anxious cabin. The final half hour of the flight felt interminable, each minute weighed down by the knowledge that they carried a dangerous device, a suspect under restraint, and nearly 200 frightened souls. The seatbelt sign remained illuminated. Turbulence rattled the plane intermittently. Babies cried. Adults murmured prayers. Dean stared at his lap, tears falling silently. Jacob stood watch, occasionally meeting Marissa's gaze. Tanya brought water to frightened passengers, trying to soothe the tension. Every second felt like a slow count toward freedom, each heartbeat echoing a collective plea. Let us land safely. Let this ordeal end. At last, the captain's voice came on, calmer than before. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We will be making an unscheduled landing at Dallas-Fort Worth International. Please remain seated with your seat belts fastened until we come to a full stop and the seatbelt sign is turned off. Emergency crews will meet us on the runway. Thank you for your patience. A round of relieved sighs and murmured thanks rose in the cabin. Even though they weren't in Los Angeles, any ground under their feet was better than staying in the air with uncertain threats. Jacob braced himself for the descent, eyes never leaving the suspect. The plane began its approach, the engine's shifting pitch as flaps extended. Nervous whispers spread as the ground came into view. A hush fell upon the aircraft when the wheels screeched against the runway. The plane shuddered, decelerating rapidly. Outside the windows, flashing lights of emergency vehicles approached. Jacob felt a flood of relief. They were on the ground, safe for now. As the plane rolled to a stop, he saw through the window a convoy of airport police cars, ambulances, and TSA vehicles. The seatbelt sign turned off with a ding. No one moved until Jacob signaled for Tanya and Marissa to open the door. Sirens wailed faintly through the sealed fuselage. A wave of uniformed officers poured onto the plane, led by a stern-faced TSA official. They swiftly took custody of Dean, who hung his head in defeat. Another set of officials carefully retrieved the device from the galley's storage, handling it with specialized gear. Jacob stepped aside, showing his credentials to the on-site officers. They recognized the Air Marshal Authority, offering nods of professional respect. One official asked him to give a quick statement. Meanwhile, paramedics checked on frightened passengers, offering water and reassurance. In the swirl of confusion, as authorities ushered passengers off the plane to a secure area in the terminal, Marissa found Jacob one last time. She took a moment to speak quietly, voice trembling with emotion. "You saved the day," she said. "I treated you terribly and you saved us all." Jacob managed a tired smile. "Part of the job. Just be kinder to your passengers next time." She nodded, eyes glistening with tears she fought to hold back. "I will. And I'm sorry, I really am." With that, the passengers disembarked. Soon, the plane was empty except for the flight crew and the investigating officers. Jacob knew he'd have to file a formal report, answer a myriad of questions. But one thing was clear. The flight attendant who had demanded he move to the back had discovered, in a heart-stopping twist of fate, that the unassuming passenger she tried to bully was the very one who would protect them all. Word of the in-flight emergency spread quickly through Delta Airlines. By the time stunned passengers were led into the terminal at Dallas-Fort Worth, airline representatives and TSA officials were already on site. Jacob, though recognized for his actions, kept a low profile, quietly giving a preliminary statement to authorities. Adrenaline still coursed through him, but relief washed over him too. Everyone was safe. Marissa, however, faced immediate scrutiny. In a corner of the waiting lounge, her supervisor, Rita Coleman, questioned her about the incident and her treatment of Jacob. Marissa, head bowed, admitted she had let personal stress cloud her judgment. She knew the airline expected professionalism at all times and that her mistake could cost her dearly. Meanwhile, Jacob conferred with TSA Agent Wilcox, who confirmed the device was a signal jammer, dangerous, but not a bomb. If Jacob hadn't intervened, it could have disrupted communications and caused chaos. Agent Wilcox commended Jacob's swift response, and Delta offered to cover his overnight needs. Jacob politely declined, needing to continue his assignment. As passengers were rebooked or accommodated for the night, Marissa came to Jacob, tears in her eyes, to apologize. Ashamed of her earlier behavior, she thanked him for saving not only the passengers, but her own dignity. He could have exposed her unprofessionalism far more harshly. Jacob accepted her apology, saying he'd rather see everyone learn from mistakes than suffer punishment. Though Delta launched a formal investigation, Marissa's genuine remorse and Jacob's measured statement helped lessen the blow. She was suspended and required to attend professional conduct training, but kept her job on probation. Thus ended a flight that began in everyday routine, took a dangerous turn at 30,000 feet, and ultimately taught Marissa the power of humility and reminded everyone that appearances can be deceiving. A few weeks later, Jacob Tyler once again found himself in line at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport. Between flights as an air marshal, he sipped coffee and scanned the concourse. Suddenly, he heard his name. It was Rita Coleman, the supervisor from Dallas, there for a management conference. She quickly updated him on Marissa. After a 2-week suspension and mandatory training, she'd returned to work on a new route, still on probation, but determined to improve. Jacob felt relief, knowing she wasn't fired. He'd never wanted revenge, only for her to learn from her mistake. After a brief chat, they parted ways. Boarding his next flight, Jacob reflected on how a single confrontation had turned life-threatening, teaching lessons in humility and hidden heroism. He settled into his seat, remembering that beneath even the most ordinary surfaces lie stories of redemption and sometimes the quiet resolve to save lives at 30,000 feet. Thank you for joining us on this dramatic journey, where a single-seat assignment dispute revealed hidden identities and tested everyone's courage at 30,000 feet. From the simmering tension of boarding to the heart-stopping discovery of a suspicious device, this story shows how fate can turn everyday moments into extraordinary confrontations. Our main character quietly dedicated to keeping passengers safe, found himself challenged by a flight attendant's misplaced authority and then rose to the occasion when true danger threatened everyone on board. It's a reminder that appearances can deceive and that kindness, respect, and vigilance are essential every time we fly. If you enjoyed this incredible tale of unexpected heroism and the powerful force of karma, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue bringing you more thrilling stories, fascinating insights, and unforgettable moments. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for more.